Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When you grow up under a man who thinks love is earned like a paycheck, you learn fast how cold the world can be, how heavy silence feels when it presses down on you at the dinner table, and how loud a father's disappointment can ring even when no words are spoken. My father, Robert Carson, was the kind of man people admired from a distance and feared up close. In our small Ohio town, he was a legend, the boy who started with nothing but a broken-down truck and a pocketful of grit, then clawed his way into owning half the damn industrial park before he was 50. Folks loved to tell his story, loved to call him self-made, like he had built himself out of barbed wire and raw muscle, with no one else ever lifting a finger to help him. Inside our house, though, Robert's empire was built a little differently, out of silence, ultimatums, and a constant reminder that nothing, not even a father's love, came free. Every day was a performance, and God help you if you missed your cue. You kept your grades perfect, your shirt tucked in, your handshake firm, and your emotions buried 6 feet under. Robert didn't tolerate crying, didn't tolerate excuses, and he sure as hell didn't tolerate failure. Failure, to him, wasn't just a misstep, it was a moral weakness, a personal insult, a reason to question why you even deserved a place at his table. My brother Daniel understood this instinctively, almost from birth. Daniel was the golden boy, varsity football captain, straight-A student, prom king, the whole damn package wrapped in a Letterman jacket and an eager, hungry smile. My sister Claire followed suit, though in her own way, polished, charming, already a future senator by the time she was in 8th grade. Then there was me, Jacob Carson, the walking disappointment, the stubborn mule who wanted to draw comic books and fix up old cars instead of chasing some soulless title like Vice President of Operations. I wasn't dumb, not by a long shot, but every time I tried to explain that I didn't want the life he was carving out for me, Robert would just stare at me with this look, like he was trying to figure out where he had gone wrong. Like he was seeing a piece of rotten wood in an otherwise perfect house. I spent most of my teenage years standing in the shadow of that look, shrinking, bending, doing anything I could to make it go away. But it never did. Not after I quit the basketball team because it made me miserable. Not after I picked community college over Yale, even though, yeah, I could have gotten in if I had cared enough to play the game. Not even after I got my certification as a mechanic and opened a little garage on the edge of town, the one place where I actually felt like myself. To the outside world, Robert was a giant, a man you named buildings after. To me, he was a mountain that could never be climbed, a king whose crown was built from other people's broken backs. Our conversations, when they happened at all, were clipped and formal, like two businessmen negotiating a deal neither of them really wanted. "How's business?" Head asked, not looking up from his steak. "Fine," I'd answer, knowing full well he thought turning wrenches was about as noble as picking up trash off the side of the highway. It wasn't all bad, I guess. There were moments, tiny, flickering things, when I thought maybe, just maybe, he saw me. Like the time he came to one of my art shows in college and stood silently in the back, his hands stuffed awkwardly in his pockets, before nodding once and leaving without a word. Or the night he helped me move into my first crappy apartment and left a brand new toolbox sitting on the kitchen counter without even pretending it was a gift. Those moments were like finding a quarter on the sidewalk, unexpected, a little pathetic in their smallness, but still better than nothing. But mostly it was cold. It was cold on Christmas mornings when Daniel and Claire unwrapped their latest awards and scholarships while I sat smiling weakly, pretending not to notice that my own envelope was thin and empty. It was cold at family dinners when the conversations turned to boardrooms and business deals and political strategies, languages I had no interest in learning. It was cold when Robert introduced us to his colleagues and never once mentioned my name, as if acknowledging me might somehow tarnish his legend. Looking back, I don't even know when the anger started to grow inside me, that slow, simmering heat that stayed just under the surface, waiting for a crack to burst through. Maybe it was when I overheard him telling a friend that 2 out of 3 ain't bad when asked about his kids. Maybe it was when he refused to come to my wedding because it clashed with some awards gala. Or maybe it was just the 1,000 little dismissals, the tiny paper cuts that, over time, bled me dry. I tried to be better. God knows I tried. I told myself he was from another generation, that he loved me in his own way, that expecting tenderness from Robert Carson was like expecting a wolf to bake you a cake. But deep down, I wanted something. Recognition. Respect. Hell, maybe just a damn handshake that wasn't cold and perfunctory, like he was shaking hands with an employee who had just barely met his quarterly goals. Instead, what I got was years of being the family ghost, the one they forgot to mention, the one they introduced as Jacob, he works with cars or something. Meanwhile, Daniel was making 6 figures by the time he was 25, and Claire was giving TED Talks about leadership and innovation. I was the grease-stained afterthought, the embarrassing footnote to Robert's sparkling resume. And yet, when the retirement party invitation arrived, thick, expensive, smelling faintly of cedar, I still felt that stupid, familiar tug inside my chest. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Maybe, after a lifetime of second-place finishes, he would finally look me in the eye and say, "You did good, son." But I should have known better. I should have burned that envelope the moment it hit my mailbox. Because the thing about kings is, they don't abdicate their thrones willingly. They don't bow to their lesser sons. They die sitting on them, stubborn and proud, pretending the whole damn kingdom isn't crumbling around them. And I wasn't about to let him die thinking he had one. The envelope arrived on a Monday morning, thick and smug, like it knew exactly the kind of message it carried and the reaction it would stir in my chest before I even peeled back the flap. Gold lettering on black cardstock, dramatic as hell, practically screaming money and legacy, and the kind of performative class my father wore like a designer suit. Join us in honoring Robert Carson for his legendary 40-year career in leadership, vision, and excellence, it read, as if the man was being knighted, not retired. There was a photo, too. Of course there was, Robert standing in front of his headquarters with that damn steel-jawed grin, the American flag flapping over his shoulder like he had personally planted it there after conquering the moon. I sat at the kitchen table holding it like it might bite me, the air around me thick with the smell of burnt toast and motor oil from my clothes. My wife, Marcy, leaned over my shoulder, squinting at the shiny print with a face that said exactly what I was thinking. "So," she said finally, "we going to the coronation, or?" I didn't answer right away because the answer wasn't simple. It never was, not when it came to Robert Carson. He was the kind of man you didn't say no to, not directly anyway. You smiled through your teeth and found polite ways to disappear, but this felt like a summons, not an invitation. The party was being held at the Cressmore Club, the most expensive place in 3 counties, the kind of venue with valet parking and chandeliers that probably cost more than my entire garage. The kind of place where people drank wine they couldn't pronounce and talked about legacy trusts and second homes in Scottsdale. I hadn't stepped foot inside the Cressmore since Daniel's wedding, and that night I spent most of the evening in the smoking area behind the kitchen with the waitstaff, talking about how the chicken was dry and the speeches never ended. But I went. Of course I went. Because not showing up wasn't just an absence, it was a message. And I wasn't ready to send that message. Not yet. I shaved, put on the nicest blazer I owned, the one with a grease stain so faint you'd only notice if the light hit just right, and showed up with Marcy on my arm and a knot in my gut that no amount of bourbon would loosen. From the moment we walked in, I could feel it. The way people looked just a second too long before smiling. The brief hesitations in their greetings, as if trying to remember who I was or what I did, and then the slow, dawning realization followed by the polite but patronizing Jacob. Of course. I've heard so much about the garage, as if I had taken up soap carving in a basement. Daniel was already there, naturally, holding court near the bar with a glass of scotch, and his wife Madison, who looked like she was carved out of Botox and ambition. He spotted me and waved, that perfect politician's wave he'd practiced since high school, and I felt my jaw tighten just a little. Claire arrived 10 minutes later, floating in on a cloud of perfume and designer heels, her arms full of campaign flyers for her upcoming city council race. Yes, even tonight, she was hustling. And of course, they all looked amazing. Daniel in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my truck, Claire in a dress that screamed class and control. Me? I looked like a +1 at my own family's party. We made small talk. Or rather, they made it, and I nodded and smiled like a man sitting through a sermon in a language he didn't speak. Marcy, bless her, tried to keep up, asking about the kids, about work, about anything that didn't sound like a resume reading, but every conversation looped back to business and success, and who had just closed a 7-figure deal in Charlotte. I started counting how many times the word legacy was used. I stopped at 12. Then came the subtle jabs. Not direct, never direct, that wasn't how our family operated. It was all in the pauses, the phrasing, the way Claire said, "It's so great you're still working with your hands," like I was whittling spoons in the mountains. Or the way Daniel asked, "Still in that same little shop, huh?" With a tone so perfectly condescending it almost deserved an award. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stayed lodged in my throat like splinters. You don't start fights at your father's party, at least, not unless you're ready to end them. Robert hadn't arrived yet. That was the other thing, he made sure to show up last, always. Grand entrances were his thing. He liked the way rooms shifted when he walked into them, the way conversations paused and eyes turned. So we waited and drank and pretended everything was fine. And as I stood by the window, watching the valet pull up with another Lexus, I started thinking about how many times I had played this role, the dutiful son, the tolerated failure. The one who smiled when he was supposed to and laughed at the right moments, even when he wanted to scream. Have you ever felt like the outsider in your own family? Like no matter what you do, you're still that disappointment they whisper about when they think you can't hear? Tell me your story in the comments, because I've got one you won't believe, and it only gets messier from here. Because the moment Robert finally walked in, the entire room tilted on its axis, just slightly, enough for everyone to shift their bodies, to turn toward him like planets realigning around the sun. And there he was, tan and polished and powerful looking, his gray suit sharp as a scalpel, his smile as blinding as ever. He walked like a man who'd never been knocked down, or if he had, made damn sure no one saw it happen. My siblings moved toward him like moths to flame, and for a split second, I considered doing the same. But I didn't move. I just stood there, watching him, thinking, he doesn't see it coming. Because tucked inside my coat, right up against my ribs, was a folder, thick, heavy, and full of the kind of truth that no gold watch or retirement toast could hide. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the failure, or the black sheep, or the outsider trying to get a seat at the table. I felt like a man who had finally decided it was time to flip the damn table over. The speech was always coming, we all knew it, because Robert Carson would never let a night this grand, this over-the-top and glistening with ego, pass without giving the final word. Every moment of the night had been orchestrated like a campaign rally, and this was the crescendo, the big, shining climax where Robert would step up to the mic, raise a glass, and deliver one of those perfectly calculated monologues that made people chuckle in public and whisper in private about how damn good he was at commanding a room. He had this thing, my father, a way of taking up all the air without ever raising his voice, of making himself look humble while making everyone else feel 2 inches tall. The room had dimmed slightly, the chandeliers casting long shadows over linen-covered tables, the crowd humming with anticipation and top-shelf liquor. Daniel gave a short and too polished introduction, peppered with just enough corporate buzzwords to make the executives in the crowd nod approvingly. Claire followed it with something heartfelt and practiced, emotional without being vulnerable, just enough tears in her voice to make the older women dab their eyes. I clapped when I was supposed to, smiled when the cameras panned our way, and kept my right hand resting calmly over the folder tucked inside my blazer, the pages within practically vibrating with the weight of everything they held. Then Robert took the floor. He didn't stride up like some guys do when they're trying to act bigger than the room. He didn't need to. He just stood up slowly, turned to the microphone, and let the silence build until the room leaned in. The man knew timing like a preacher on Easter Sunday. His voice was rich and relaxed, the voice of a man who believed every word he was about to say, whether it was true or not. He talked about the journey, about starting with nothing, about grit and sacrifice and late nights in the warehouse and missing birthdays and anniversaries and Christmases because a man's got to build something worth leaving behind. People laughed when he wanted them to, nodded when he asked rhetorical questions, and looked around like they were in the presence of a living monument. I listened, chewing the inside of my cheek, each line tightening the knot in my stomach. It wasn't that the speech was all lies, it was worse. It was made of half-truths, twisted just enough to shine him up like a statue while sanding down the edges of everyone else who'd ever been burned in the process. Then it came. The moment that pulled the trigger I'd been holding for years. He raised his glass, paused for effect, looked around the room with mock warmth, and said in that too charming voice of his, "And as I look at my beautiful family tonight, my legacy, I'm reminded that what you leave behind matters more than what you take with you. That's why I always said, only the successful kids deserve a share of the kingdom." The room broke into laughter, real, uncomfortable, or forced. I couldn't tell anymore, but in that second, the sound was a blade to the chest. Daniel chuckled like he was in on the joke. Claire gave that smile she used when she was trying to look above it all. Marcy's hand slipped gently onto mine, her thumb pressing down like she already knew I was seconds away from breaking something. I didn't react. Not on the outside. Not at first. I sat there, stone-faced, while the toast finished and glasses clinked and music started again. I looked across the table at Robert, who had already moved on to shaking hands and back-patting, as if his words weren't bullets aimed right at me. It wasn't just the insult, it was the precision of it. That line had been crafted. That line had been meant for me. Only the successful kids deserve a share. That wasn't just a joke. That was a message. That was Robert Carson taking one last swing at the son who refused to play by his rules, and doing it in front of everyone he wanted to impress. It was his final verdict, carved into stone. Jacob doesn't count. Jacob doesn't measure up. Jacob isn't worthy. I stood up quietly. Not with a slam or a scene, just slow, deliberate, polite enough that nobody noticed at first. Marcy looked up at me with wide, uncertain eyes, but I touched her shoulder gently and said I just needed some air. I didn't storm out, didn't knock over a wine glass or say something dramatic. I walked, calmly, out through the side doors and into the hall where the laughter and string quartet music faded behind me like static in another room. I didn't leave the building. I didn't leave the party. I walked to the coat check, retrieved nothing, and slipped into the side hallway near the service entrance, where I could breathe without pretending. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. The folder inside my jacket felt like it was glowing, humming with every second that passed, daring me to open it. Because that was it, the moment he crossed the last line. And maybe it had taken years of silence, of swallowing every slight, every rejection, every quiet dinner where I wasn't even worth eye contact. But tonight, he made sure everyone heard it. Only the successful kids deserve a share. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had finally stopped wanting a share. I didn't want a seat at the table anymore. I wanted to flip the whole damn table and show them what it had cost the rest of us to keep pretending it was solid. And Robert Carson, the cell-made king, the legend, the father who thought he could measure love in dollars and net worths, he was about to find out that some legacies don't end with a gold watch and polite applause. Some legacies end in silence breaking open like thunder. They say knowledge is power, but no one warns you it's also a loaded gun, heavy, dangerous, and something you can't unhold once you've wrapped your fingers around it. I didn't go looking for ammunition, not at first. All I wanted was answers, maybe even some weird kind of closure, something to explain why a man like Robert Carson could make a son feel like a defective part in a machine he never asked to be built into. But what I found was something else entirely. What I found didn't explain his cruelty. It revealed something worse, that the empire he lorded over us wasn't just built on discipline and drive like he always preached. No, it was stitched together with lies, bribes, betrayal, and rot so deep it made me sick the first time I read the details. It started the day my mom called me nearly 6 months before the party, her voice thin and distant like she was standing across a canyon. She had finally decided to go through the storage unit Robert had been renting for decades, the one where he kept company overflow, or so he'd said, which sounded vague as hell and always had. He was planning to downsize a few things, maybe shift some assets before retirement, and she wanted to tidy up, in her words, before he got involved and complicated it all. Just a few boxes, she told me. Probably old invoices or trophies or God knows what else. Thought maybe you could swing by and help me lift the heavier ones. I didn't jump at the chance, but I owed her. She was always caught in the blast radius of his intensity, always deflecting, always trying to smooth things over between her husband and her children, like a diplomat negotiating with a dictator. So I went. The unit was in a dusty row of climate-controlled lockers near the edge of town, where old wealth and secrets both seemed to end up when they were inconvenient, but not disposable. We lifted boxes, we stacked things neatly, and somewhere in the back, I found a locked metal drawer unit with a broken label that simply read Clients 1992 to 2004. It took me about 20 minutes to jimmy the thing open with a flathead screwdriver and some rusted patience. I expected contracts, maybe some old payrolls or client intake forms. What I got instead was a set of manila folders, one marked with my mother's name, which made my stomach turn, and another, thicker one, that read, Legal, confidential, internal only. I opened that one last. The documents inside weren't just bad, they were radioactive. Misappropriated funds, shady offshore account transfers, records of payouts labeled miscellaneous settlement, and a few typed letters that strongly suggested Robert had been covering up a former executive's misconduct in exchange for loyalty and silence. And that was just the start. There were years of financial reports that didn't match the publicly filed ones, donation records tied to backdoor city council deals, and even a scanned contract with someone I recognized. A local developer who had mysteriously gone bankrupt in the early 2000s while my father's holdings expanded overnight in the same region. I sat there on the cold concrete floor, my palms sweating, trying to tell myself I was misreading it, that it was outdated or misfiled or maybe just a pile of half-truths designed to protect someone else. But the signatures were his. The dates lined up. And the worst part? There were notes, handwritten ones from Robert himself, with phrases like handle quietly and don't loop in Jacob, unnecessary. That last part was the cruelest and, somehow, the most clarifying. Not just that he'd done these things, but that even in the middle of his scheming, he'd specifically thought to keep me out of it, not to protect me, but because I was irrelevant to the machine. I wasn't part of the family business not because I chose not to be, but because he never intended me to be. I didn't take all the files. That would have been too obvious, too noisy. Instead, I scanned what I needed, carefully, methodically, and sent the originals right back to where I found them. Then I spent the next few months reading, rereading, and cross-referencing everything, looking for anything that would prove this wasn't just bad judgment or a few desperate decisions. It was a pattern. A structure built on shadows. A legacy of exploitation dressed up as leadership. I printed the most damning documents, highlighted the relevant sections, and placed them in a plain, unassuming folder, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention until I wanted it to. And then I waited. That's the part they don't tell you about revenge, the quiet waiting. You still go to work, still fix engines and replace carburetors, still kiss your wife goodnight, and smile when she asks if you're okay. But inside, something sharp and patient sits coiled, waiting for the right moment to rise. Not out of rage. Not even out of bitterness anymore, but out of something colder. Something like purpose. When the retirement party invitation arrived, I didn't even flinch. I just slid the folder into my coat pocket, zipped it up, and went back to work. Some men build legacies out of steel and sweat, and some build them out of illusion and fear. And some sons, the forgotten ones, the underestimated ones, spend their lives wondering if they'll ever measure up, only to discover they were never meant to. Because measuring up would mean becoming like the man who's spent his life measuring everything. I never wanted to be like Robert Carson, but I was starting to wonder what it meant if I was finally ready to destroy him, and what it would cost me if I did. The thing about moments like that, moments when you finally decide to set fire to everything you have ever known, is that they start small, almost unnoticeable, like the first whiff of smoke in a crowded theater where nobody wants to admit something is wrong. Standing there in the side hallway, the muffled sounds of laughter and the clink of glass tumbling through the heavy doors behind me, I pressed my hand once more against the folder hidden inside my jacket and felt a strange, unnerving calm settle over me, like the hush before a storm. I had gone over this in my mind so many times that it almost felt rehearsed, but the reality was rawer, heavier, almost sacred in its own brutal way. This was not some outburst of rage, not a drunken scene designed to ruin a night out of petty spite. No, this was something far colder and more deliberate. This was an unveiling, a removal of the mask Robert Carson had worn so flawlessly for so many years, and if the room was not ready for it, if the crowd that worshipped him as a self-made king was not ready for it, well, that was their problem, not mine. I stepped back into the ballroom just as the band struck up a smooth, syrupy tune that no one was really listening to, the music merely a background hum to the endless networking, the endless congratulating, the endless celebrating of a man who, in their minds, had conquered the American dream by sheer force of will. My wife Marcy spotted me immediately, her face tightening, her eyes flashing with 100 silent questions she knew better than to ask aloud. I gave her a look, not angry, not scared, just steady, and I saw something flicker in her, something like fear but deeper, something like understanding. I crossed the room without rushing, weaving through clusters of well-dressed guests and half-finished conversations, nodding politely as people stepped aside, not quite sure why, not quite sure what they were seeing. I could feel the subtle shift, the way a ripple moves through a pond when a stone is dropped in, the way attention started to gather even before I spoke a word. Robert was near the center, exactly where he liked to be, surrounded by executives, old friends, local politicians, the kinds of people who treated him like a living monument. His glass was half raised in mid-salute to someone's toast when he caught sight of me approaching, and for a split second, I saw it, the flash of annoyance, the calculation, the weighing of whether I was about to embarrass myself or, worse, embarrass him. I stopped about 6 feet away, just outside the tight circle of his admirers, and for a moment I said nothing. The music played. People laughed. Forks scraped across plates. And then I cleared my throat, not loudly, but with enough force that it cut across the room like a blade, the simple human noise somehow sharper than the loudest shout. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Someone silenced the band with a quick wave of the hand, and the sudden quiet was thick and waiting, full of that terrible, thrilling potential. I pulled the folder from my jacket, held it up for a second like a man offering proof of life, and then, with deliberate, careful movements, opened it. My name, I said, voice steady enough to make my heart pound harder, is Jacob Carson. I'm Robert's son. The murmuring began immediately, low and confused and already buzzing with anticipation. Some people smiled awkwardly, expecting a speech, maybe a tearful tribute or a nostalgic story about childhood fishing trips and hard-earned wisdom. I gave them no such thing. I came here tonight because I believed, foolishly, that this was a celebration of integrity, of hard work, of sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. I flipped the first page. But what we're actually celebrating, I said, my voice growing just a little louder, just enough to reach the back of the room, is something else entirely. The first document I read was a copy of a confidential settlement from 1998 involving an employee who had filed a harassment suit that was quietly paid off with non-disclosure agreements and severance packages hidden under creative accounting. The room shifted, ever so slightly, as people leaned in or pulled back, instinctively sensing that the ground under their feet was no longer steady. I moved to the next page without pausing, outlining the real estate deal that had bankrupted a rival and doubled Robert's holdings in less than 6 months, complete with falsified appraisals and undisclosed partnerships. I read excerpts from the email chains, recited dates and figures, letting the numbers and the timelines pile up like bodies at the foot of a collapsing statue. At first, there was stunned silence. Then the murmurs grew louder, angrier, edgier. A woman in a navy dress grabbed her husband's arm and whispered something frantic. 2 men near the bar exchanged a look and quietly slipped toward the exits, their faces pale and stiff. Some people stayed frozen, their hands suspended halfway to their mouths, as if they had forgotten how to finish lifting their drinks. I looked up, and there was Robert, still standing, still trying to project that iron control, but the smile was gone now, wiped clean like chalk off a blackboard. His face was tight, the veins in his neck standing out, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides, as if fighting the urge to physically rip the papers from my hand. He opened his mouth once, twice, but no words came out. No polished speech. No folksy parable about hard work and perseverance. Just a heavy, furious breathing that sounded so loud in the dead-still room that I thought for a second I could hear the blood pounding in his ears. I kept reading. The offshore accounts. The payoffs. The fake charities used to launder political donations. Page after page after page, each one another hammer blow to the myth of Robert Carson, each one another crack in the marble facade he had spent 40 years polishing to a blinding shine. Some people started to leave openly now, their heads down, moving quickly, like rats off a sinking ship. Others stayed rooted to their spots, their faces a mix of horror and fascination, like people watching a building collapse and unable to look away. I read until my voice started to crack, until the folder in my hands was nothing but a limp stack of papers, and still no one interrupted me, no one dared to speak over the sound of a kingdom falling apart in real time. When I finally stopped, when the last word had been spoken and the last ugly secret had been dragged into the light, I closed the folder slowly and placed it on the table beside me like a gavel sealing a verdict. I did not shout. I did not gloat. I simply stood there, breathing hard, my hands steady, my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. Robert stared at me, his face unreadable now, his kingdom crumbling around him in a fog of shame and disbelief. And then, without another word, I turned and walked away from the table, leaving the folder, the wreckage, and the legend of Robert Carson lying behind me like a battlefield soaked in blood and silence. The thing about tearing down a monument is that you never really know what kind of rubble you are going to find underneath until the dust settles and the crowd either gasps or walks away in silence, pretending they never laid eyes on it at all. When I walked away from that table, leaving the folder like a loaded gun still smoking under the crystal lights, I half expected someone to tackle me or shout me down or maybe even punch me square in the jaw. What I did not expect was the way the room fractured in slow, painful increments, like a frozen lake cracking under too much weight. I didn't get far before I heard the first rumble of Robert's voice, deep and strained, the kind of tone he usually reserved for closed-door meetings where nobody was allowed to leave until he had the last word. He was trying to laugh, I realized with a sick twist in my gut, actually trying to pass it all off like a joke gone too far, a misunderstanding. The crazy imaginings of a bitter, jealous son who just couldn't hack it in the real world. "Come on, folks," he said, spreading his arms wide in that same grand gesture he had used 1,000 times before to sell people on his version of reality. "You know how family is, always digging up old grudges, old stories, trying to settle scores. Hell, I'd be disappointed if he didn't at least try to throw a punch on my big night. There were a few scattered chuckles, but they sounded weak and forced, like air leaking out of a tire. Most people just stood there, their faces tight, their bodies angled slightly toward the exits, as if instinctively preparing to flee at the first real sign of collapse. I leaned against the far wall, arms crossed over my chest, watching it unfold with a numb sort of fascination, the way you might watch a building you once lived in slowly burn down to the foundation. Claire was the first to move, high heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor as she stalked toward Robert, her hands slicing through the air in tight, furious motions. I couldn't hear every word, but the gist of it was clear enough. Damage control, spin, immediate public denial followed by quiet backroom settlements, if necessary. She was already thinking like a politician, already calculating how to salvage what she could from the wreckage, even if it meant stepping over her own father's smoldering reputation to do it. Daniel, on the other hand, stood frozen at the table, a glass of scotch dangling from his fingers, his face a pale, slack mask of something that looked an awful lot like recognition. Not disbelief. Not outrage. Recognition. Like some part of him had known, had always known, and just never had the stomach to look it straight in the eye until now. Robert was still talking, still spinning, but the cracks were showing now in his voice, in his posture, in the way his smile kept slipping sideways like a mask too loose to stay in place. He jabbed a finger at the folder, calling it fake, doctored, the work of a resentful son trying to make himself feel important. He barked at Daniel to back him up, to tell everyone how good a father he had been, how solid a man, but Daniel said nothing. He just stared at the papers on the table like they might catch fire if he looked away. And then it happened, the twist I hadn't seen coming, the moment that turned a personal reckoning into a public uprising. A voice from the back of the room, sharp and trembling with the kind of anger that has been buried for decades, cut through the thick, choking air. "You didn't just screw over your enemies, Robert," the woman said, stepping forward into the flickering light. "You screwed over your friends too." It was Mrs. Lanning, an old family friend whose husband had mysteriously lost his job and his pension, right around the same time Robert had secured a lucrative government contract 2 towns over. She was shaking as she spoke, but her words were knives, and once she started, it was like opening a floodgate. Another man stepped forward, then another, and then a woman whose name I barely remembered from childhood barbecues and company picnics, each one carrying their own story, their own scar, their own proof that Robert Carson's empire wasn't just built on sacrifice and ambition, it was built on the broken backs of everyone who had ever trusted him. Robert tried to shout them down, tried to wave it off, but his voice was drowned out by the rising tide of voices, each one pulling another thread from the carefully woven tapestry of his legend until it unraveled completely, the truth spilling out faster than he could bury it. Marcy found me at the edge of the chaos, her face pale but her hands steady as she reached for mine. "You sure you're ready for what's coming next?" she asked quietly, and for a long moment I didn't answer because I wasn't sure. I had spent so long dreaming of this moment, of the day the man who had spent his life measuring my worth with a scale tipped against me would finally be exposed, that I had never really thought about what would be left when the dust finally settled. Across the room, Robert sagged into a chair, his head in his hands, the crowd now openly fragmenting, some leaving in disgust, some staying out of a morbid sense of duty or curiosity, but none of them looking at him the same way they had before. Not a hero, not a titan, just another man who got caught thinking he was bigger than the consequences of his own actions. Claire was still trying to salvage something, arguing with a small cluster of executives near the bar, her hands animated, her voice sharp. Daniel finally put down his drink and walked away from the table, not toward Robert, but toward the doors, his shoulders hunched like a man carrying the sudden realization that the foundation of his life had always been made of sand. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the crackling sound of a kingdom crumbling, the sound of lies dying in the open air, and I felt something unexpected, not triumph, not even relief, but a heavy, aching sadness that settled in my chest like a stone. Because no matter how right it felt to finally tell the truth, the cost of doing so was written in the broken faces of the people who had believed the lie, who had built their lives around it, who would now have to live with the wreckage just like I did. And the worst part was, as I watched Robert's reflection sagging in the giant mirror behind the head table, shattered and distorted by the cracks running through the glass, I realized that part of me still wanted him to stand up, to fight back, to be the man he had always claimed to be, not for his sake, but for mine. Because if he wasn't the giant, if he was just another coward in $1,000 suit, then what did that make the boy who had spent his whole life trying to earn his approval? I pushed the thought down hard and turned away, walking toward the exit, leaving the broken mirror, the broken king, and the broken kingdom behind me, but knowing deep down that some cracks, once opened, don't ever really close. By the next morning, it was not just a bad dream or a whispered rumor confined to a smoky ballroom full of half-drunk witnesses. It was on the front page of every local paper, splashed across websites that never missed a chance to gnaw on the bones of a fallen titan, written in cold, unfeeling headlines that stripped the man I had grown up fearing into nothing more than another scandal to be consumed before breakfast. Business mogul Robert Carson accused of corruption, fraud, the headlines screamed, stacked between articles about city council meetings and high school football scores, as if the collapse of everything he had built was just another Tuesday's news. The news vans had already started showing up outside his gated house before noon, idling at the curb with cameras trained on the windows like vultures waiting for the first visible twitch of a dying animal. I watched it all unfold from the cracked leather couch in my living room, the same place where I had once spent hours thinking about how small my life must have looked to him. Watching now as his entire kingdom was dismantled piece by piece on live television by people who did not even know him, who did not even care. It should have felt like victory, a clean and satisfying conclusion to a battle I had been fighting since I was old enough to realize I was never going to be good enough for him. But it did not feel like victory. It felt hollow, like standing in the smoking ruins of a house you set on fire and realizing you are still shivering from the cold. Every part of me had expected to feel lighter, freer, vindicated somehow, as if pulling the mask off Robert Carson would also pull the invisible chains off my own shoulders. Instead, all I felt was heavy, like I was walking through wet concrete, each step harder than the last, every breath thick with smoke I could not cough out no matter how hard I tried. Marcy sat beside me in silence, her hand resting lightly on my knee, grounding me even as I floated somewhere outside my own skin. She did not say, "I told you so," even though she could have, even though she had warned me that vengeance, once tasted, often leaves a sour aftertaste no amount of triumph could wash away. She just sat there, waiting, letting me unravel at my own pace, the way you wait for a storm to spend itself out rather than trying to stand in its path. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Reporters, lawyers, people I had not heard from in years, suddenly desperate for a quote or a comment or a piece of the wreckage they could turn into their own headlines. I did not answer. I let it all ring into the void, a chorus of noise that felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. Daniel called too, finally, late in the afternoon when the sun was low and red and everything outside looked bruised. I stared at his name flashing on the screen for a long time before finally picking up, not because I wanted to talk, but because some part of me needed to hear how it sounded coming from him, the anger, the disbelief, the betrayal. "You didn't just take him down," Daniel said, his voice raw and shaking. "You took all of us down with him." For a long moment, I said nothing, because what was there to say? He was right in a way. The fallout was not just Robert's to bear. It spread like wildfire, consuming everyone close enough to breathe in the smoke. Claire's campaign had already collapsed in on itself like a rotten foundation, donors pulling out faster than rats from a sinking ship. Daniel's consulting firm was quietly backing away, issuing statements about reevaluating partnerships and aligning with ethical standards. Even my mother, who had spent a lifetime smoothing over Robert's rough edges, was caught in the blast, her name dragged through gossip she had never deserved. "You think I didn't know he was a bastard?" Daniel said, his voice cracking with something that might have been grief or rage or both. "You think Claire didn't know? You think Mom didn't wake up every damn day knowing exactly what kind of man she was married to? We all knew, Jake. We just chose to live with it. You chose to burn it all down." I almost said, "Good," but the word stuck in my throat like a bone. Instead, I said I didn't do it for revenge. It sounded weak even to my own ears, and Daniel laughed, a short, broken sound that carried no real humor. "Then what the hell did you do it for?" he asked, and before I could answer, he hung up, leaving me staring at the deadline like it might somehow offer an answer if I looked long enough. I turned off the TV after that, turned off my phone, turned off the world, and sat there in the growing dark, thinking about legacies, about fathers and sons, about the way you can spend your whole life trying to build something better than the wreckage you were handed and still end up with blood on your hands. Was it justice? Was it revenge? Or was it something smaller and sadder? The desperate act of a boy who just wanted to be seen, finally, by the man who had spent his life pretending he was invisible? The next day, I drove past Robert's office building, or what used to be his building before it was surrounded by crime scene tape and news cameras, and stared up at the giant steel letters spelling out his name. They looked smaller now, somehow ordinary, like a kid's project made of tinfoil and glue. It struck me then that no matter how big you build it, no matter how many awards or plaques or corner offices you stack up, you cannot build something real on lies. Eventually, it cracks. Eventually, it falls. But standing there, watching the name begin to be pulled down piece by workers who didn't even know who he was, I also realized something else, something harder to swallow. You can tear down a monument, sure. You can grind it into dust and sweep it into the gutters. But you cannot tear down the empty space it leaves behind, the hollow where it used to stand, the ache of all the years you spent measuring yourself against it. I drove home in silence, the folders still locked away in the glove compartment like a spent weapon, my hands steady on the wheel even as my heart splintered in ways I did not know how to fix. Ashes of a legacy, I thought. Ashes and nothing more. I knew I would have to see him eventually, knew it like you know a storm is coming even before the first black clouds edge over the horizon, that feeling in your bones that no matter how long you try to outrun it, sooner or later you are going to have to stand there and let it hit you full in the chest. I thought maybe he would come to me first, thought maybe pride or anger or some twisted version of fatherly duty would push him through my front door, demanding explanations or apologies or blood. But Robert Carson was not that kind of man, not when the stakes were this high and his armor was already cracked and flaking away. He retreated instead, like a wounded animal, licking his wounds somewhere behind thick curtains and locked gates, waiting for the firestorm to burn itself out or maybe just for everyone to forget he ever stood at the center of it. It was me who made the move in the end, because no matter how much of him I had torn down, no matter how much of his legend now lay in smoking ruins at his feet, some part of me still needed to finish it. Needed to look him in the eyes one last time and ask the question that had been burning a hole in my chest for as long as I could remember. I drove to the old house without telling Marcy, without calling ahead, just parked at the curb and stared at the front porch where, years ago, I had sat with a bloody nose after taking my first punch from a kid who said my dad thought he was better than everybody else. The house looked smaller now, shabbier somehow without the weight of his reputation looming over it like a cathedral. Funny how much power a building loses once you stop believing it holds anything sacred. I let myself in through the side door because the front one was probably still rigged with alarms and cameras and locks you could not pick without half a toolbox. The kitchen was dark, the whole place smelling faintly of stale coffee and old leather, and I found him in the den where he had spent so many evenings nursing cheap whiskey and expensive grudges. He was sitting in his recliner, the TV off, the room lit only by the late afternoon sun slanting through the heavy drapes. For a second, he did not look up, and I thought maybe he had fallen asleep, But then his eyes flicked open and found me, sharp and clear and still full of that same unyielding steel that had once made grown men stammer and forget their own names. We stared at each other across the dead space of the room, two men who knew there was no fixing what had been broken, only deciding what kind of wreckage we were willing to walk away from. It was him who spoke first, voice low and rough, like gravel grinding underfoot. "So," he said, and even that one syllable was soaked in contempt. "Come to finish the job?" I could have lied, could have said I came to make peace or to explain or to find closure, but the truth was heavier and simpler than any of that. I crossed the room, dropped into the chair opposite him, and said, "I came to see if you even still recognize yourself." He snorted, a dry, brittle sound, and leaned back in the chair like a man settling in for a beating he no longer feared. "You think you're different," he said, eyes glittering with something that was not quite anger and not quite pride, something meaner and colder and harder to name. "You think burning me down makes you better than me." I didn't answer right away because part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime twisting itself into knots trying to be seen, to be worthy, wanted to argue, wanted to list every way I was different, better, stronger, more honest. But the other part, the part that had carried the folder into the party and read it out loud without a quiver in my voice, the part that had stood there while the man who made me crumbled like dust in front of the world, that part knew better. "I don't know what I am anymore," I said finally, and the admission tasted like blood in my mouth. For a long moment, he said nothing, just sat there looking at me, the silence between us thick and suffocating. Then, in a voice so soft I almost did not hear it, he said, "Good." That one word hit harder than all the curses and accusations he could have thrown. Because if he hated me, if he disowned me, if he screamed and shouted and called me a traitor, I could have walked away clean. But this quiet, satisfied approval? It was a stain I would never scrub off, no matter how hard I tried. I stood up, suddenly needing distance, air, anything but the stink of that dying empire and the man who still thought he had somehow won by dragging me down into the dirt with him. At the door, I hesitated, hand on the knob, not looking back. "You built this," I said quietly. "You made all of this." I heard him laugh behind me, low and broken and full of the kind of bitterness that rots a man from the inside out. "And you," he said, "are the only one who had the guts to tear it down." I walked out before he could say anything else, before I could hear any more truths I was not ready to carry. Outside, the sun was setting, turning the sky into a riot of blood red and deep purple, the kind of sky that makes you think of endings, not beginnings. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, looking back at the house, at the cracked foundation and the peeling paint, at the ghost of the boy who used to sit on those steps and dream of something better. Some ghosts do not die, not really. They just settle into your bones, into your blood, into the way you move through the world, whispering in your ear long after the shouting has stopped. I smiled then, though I could not have told you whether it was out of triumph or heartbreak, whether it was the grin of a man who had finally been freed or the grimace of a man who knew he had just finished becoming the thing he had spent his whole life trying not to be. The wind kicked up, carrying the smell of burning leaves and cold earth, and I turned away from the wreckage, walking into the gathering dark with my hands shoved deep in my pockets, and my heart a little heavier, a little harder, a little more like his. And somewhere deep inside me, a voice I barely recognized whispered that the apple, after all, had not fallen so far from the tree.